This is The Cluttered Path, stories about life and the human experience. My name is Todd, and I'm here with James.
Good morning, Todd. I hope you're well today.
Doing well, thanks.
Awesome.
We continue today with the life of Genghis Khan. Today's episode is going to touch on the very real personal struggles that Genghis Khan faced. I mean, he had pressure from his success and also this infighting amongst his people. We're going to talk about that. He was also looking forward to a peaceful life that really just never came to be. And he also looked back on his life, assessing himself as both a leader and a father. And we're going to delve into those things today. So, James, I was listening to the Sean Ryan Show, a podcast hosted by a former Navy SEAL and CIA contractor. One of Sean's guests was a Vietnamese man named Tu Lam. It's T-U, and then his last name is just L-A-M. But Tu Lam, as a young boy in the early 70s, his family were refugees who escaped Vietnam and eventually migrated to the United States, escaping communism. Here in America, he faced poverty and racism as a child, but he got into martial arts at around the age of 8, and it really influenced his perspective. After graduating high school, he joined the U.S. Army and became a Green Beret. He ended up fighting all over the world as part of the global war on terror. He was also an MMA fighter while he was in the military and had a lot of success and money that came from that. And in his interview with Sean Ryan, Tu Lam spoke of how the horrors of combat took an immense toll on him. I mean, it just filled him with hate. There was this physical, mental, and emotional trauma, and that led to addiction to painkillers. From an outsider's perspective, he was on top of the world. He was successful in his career, and he had a wife and kids. But war had really just destroyed him inside. Now, Tu Lam would eventually go on to find healing after retiring from the army, but here's how it relates to our current discussion. I see parallels in the lives of Tu Lam and Genghis Khan. Both Tu Lam and Genghis Khan experienced a lot of trauma as children, and then as adults, they were both warriors. They each responded to their calling and became excellent students of war. Tu Lam talked about the terrible impact that war had on his body and mind. And I would submit that a lifetime of warfare must have also had a destructive impact on Genghis Khan. We see him as a hugely successful military leader and statesman. And from the outside, he's at the pinnacle of human achievement with the world at his feet. But I just have to point out that he was only human. A man who had to process a lot of horrible things while having a lot of pressure on him from others. The story of Tu Lam and many other combat veterans tells me that war wreaked havoc on Genghis Khan's physical, mental, and spiritual health. And that is the human element of this story, and we'll discuss that today. In our last episode, the Jurched in China, they had sent a delegation demanding fealty and monetary tribute from the Mongols. Given the choice between slavery and war, though, the Mongols chose to fight. And winning that war in China brought vast amounts of wealth to the Mongols. But today we'll learn that troubles are waiting back in Mongolia, and there are actually more wars to fight. Genghis Khan's pursuit of a peaceful existence would never come to fruition.
I have to admit that reading and learning about how his life played out left me feeling a little sad for him.
Yes.
Let's dig into that.
Yep. So now we pick up the story where the Mongol army comes home from China. We'll start with an excerpt from the book. Quote, "Through the first half of the year 1215, the Mongols slowly set out with caravans of people, animals, and goods from the smoldering ruins of Zhongdu, that was Beijing, China today, smoldering ruins of Zhongdu to the high arid plateau of Inner Mongolia. Genghis Khan had once again shown his ability to win in war, and now he demonstrated on a scale unprecedented in the history of steppe Khans, his ability to bring the goods home to his people. A river of brightly colored silk flowed out of China. It was as though Genghis Khan had rerouted all the different twisting channels of the silk route, combined them into one large stream, and redirected it northward to spill out across the Mongol steppes. In all the centuries of raiding and trading, no leader had brought back to his homeland nearly the amount of goods as Genghis Khan. But vast as the quantities were, the appetites of his own people were insatiable. As he returned from his campaigns, His caravans were laden with valuable goods, but each load created the desire for yet more. End of quote. So instead of a hero's welcome and a life of peace back home, the wealth of China brought more problems. So there's just no rest for the weary. So there were three main areas of trouble that Genghis Khan and the Mongols faced after their war in China. The first was the problem of affluence. And as we just read, there was this flow of goods coming from China, and it just created a desire for more. Every Mongol had very expensive luxury goods in their tents. And the book uses this phrase. It says, quote, novelties became necessities. And so what that did was it just added this immense pressure on Genghis Khan to deliver. Not only did they have nice things, but they had too much of it. And for the first time in Mongol history, Genghis Khan had buildings erected just specifically to store all the goods that they brought home from China. So there's just nothing new under the sun here. It's as if this ancient society experiences the same first world problems we have today. More stuff equals more problems.
Yeah, today, indeed, that really, really hits home for me. My wife and I are on a decluttering and simplifying mission for our own lives.
Right. And the Mongols didn't have a cool website to talk about declutter and simplifying their lives. Oh, my word. More stuff, more problems.
Yes.
So the Silk Route extends, I would just say that the Silk Route, it extends all the way into the U.S. today because we also have this problem of affluence. Genghis Khan had problems back home, but the second problem they faced were problems abroad. And the first came in the form of the Siberian forest tribes up in modern-day Russia. So while the Mongols had been fighting in China, the Siberian tribes had stopped paying taxes, and the taxes were in the form of goods sent back to Mongolia. So to deal with this, Genghis Khan starts with diplomacy. A Mongol envoy was sent to inquire, and he was taken captive by their new female queen. So then he sends in a negotiator. He was taken captive too. And the next is military intervention. Genghis Khan sends in a trusted general along with a detachment of soldiers. And the Siberian queen, she ends up setting an ambush for them, waiting for them, and attacks them. And the Mongol general is killed. At this point, Genghis Khan is enraged. So now he sends in a large expedition with instructions to win at all cost. And the Mongols end up winning, and the envoys are freed, and the people are brought back as servants to the Mongols. And the queen, who had done all of this, she was given to this envoy as a wife. So this was the first thing they dealt with, and that trouble in Siberia ended up being a minor distraction compared to the issues that cropped up with the Uyghur people, where they end up crying for help. So the Uyghur, we talked about them in a previous episode. The Uyghur lived in an area known as the Kashgar region, which is in modern-day Western China. It's basically where China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan meet. In Kashgar, there was a man named Kublai Khan. I hope I'm pronouncing that name properly. Doing my best here with my Western tongue. But in Kashgar, there was that guy. His name is Kublai Khan, and he was a leader of the Naiman clan that Genghis Khan had defeated years prior. He had become a ruler over the Uyghur people in Kashgar at this point. And Kublai Khan was a Christian who decided to impose his beliefs on the people by outlawing Muslim worship. So there is religious persecution of these Uyghur Muslims going on. And they were allied to Genghis Khan, so they lobbied him to free them from this oppression. So the Mongols end up conducting a military campaign to free the Uyghur. They end up conducting this at the behest or the request of the Uyghurs. So the Mongol rules of engagement were different on this expedition. What they did was, first off, the plunder of goods and destruction of property was forbidden because they're there to help their allies. And then they also sought to protect the lives of civilians because we're talking about the Uyghur people that are their vassal state. And so then also, as an extension of that, the valuables that were taken were actually left to the Uyghur people as the rightful owners of it. And then eventually Kublai was defeated and beheaded. So that's the military campaign to free the Uyghur. Just looking at the aftermath of the war in Kashgar, there were some cool things that happened. For the Kashgar people, first off, they were visited by a herald from Mongolia, and that herald proclaimed the end to religious persecution. So religious freedom is restored to the Uyghur people. And then this Persian historian, his name is Giovanni, he recorded that, quote, "The people of Kashgar proclaimed the Mongols to be one of the mercies of the Lord and one of the bounties of divine grace," end of quote. So that was for the Kashgar people. It was a happy time for them. They'd been freed from religious persecution. But for the Mongols, they considered this fight as their duty toward a vassal state, but there were some unforeseen benefits that came out of this. First off, the campaign itself proved that the Mongol army could operate thousands of miles from home without Genghis Khan directly in command. That was a first. Also, the victory in Kashgar, it gave Genghis Khan complete control over the Silk Route between Chinese and Muslim peoples. So this new access to trade with Muslim countries in Central Asia and the Middle East, it was a scenario where goods were produced in China and sold in Muslim lands out to the east. So control of this trade route was a huge benefit. So these benefits of both newly discovered military capability and expanded trade, they were fortuitous. So that was the second issue they faced. The third problem they faced is just simply the human toll of war. And like we discussed at the beginning here, Genghis Khan was only human. He had endured decades of warfare, and now he's got all these political pressures of nation building. And I just have to remind myself, he wasn't just a political leader sitting in ivory towers of a peaceful capital debating theory. He experienced violent struggle for survival his entire life. From birth, Genghis Khan lived through the horrors of violent armed conflict, and he ended up emerging as the leader of the Mongols, and he didn't have any ambition to do that from the outset. And later we'll learn that his family was in shambles. We'll talk about that in a bit. And the book doesn't cover it, but I would submit that these physical, mental, and spiritual tolls, they were just so destructive on Genghis Khan and left him distant from his immediate family and just unable to instill his own core beliefs in his children.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. From the childhood trauma to the responsibility of protecting his family, then protecting his clan, and then finally the Mongol people, he wound up taking on a whole lot of stuff, and it would just make sense.
Right. I would say that it was just foisted on him, and yeah, I mean, he accepted it though. It wasn't that he was acting against his will, but yeah, it was a lot on him.
Yeah.
So we'll talk more about the human cost later, but for now, after the war in Kashgar, the Mongols would have a period of peace, but that wouldn't last long because the Sultan of a place called Khwarizm chooses violence. Now, at this point in the story, it's the year 1219. Genghis Khan is nearly 60 years old. He'd brought about what the book calls, quote, complete peace and quiet, security and tranquility, end of quote. The roads were secure and clan warfare was just non-existent. And Genghis Khan looked forward to living out his days in peace, enjoying his family and their prosperity, but that just was not to be. Now, sadly, if Genghis Khan paused and stopped pursuing these national goals, the book says that factionalism in his own family would just simply tear the empire apart. So Genghis Khan turns his attention to the west, the Empire of Khwarizm. This was a huge area that stretched from Afghanistan to the Black Sea. And the Muslim countries in that region had excellent steel and textiles and also the ability to make glass. And this was new for the Mongols. So the new mission for the Mongols was to use their massive wealth to foster trade with the Khwarizm. So Genghis Khan sends an envoy to the Sultan of Khwarizm with a simple message. And here's an excerpt from the book. Quote, "I have the greatest desire to live in peace with you. I shall look on you as my son. For your part, you are not unaware that I have conquered North China and subjected all the tribes of the north. You know that my country is an ant heap of warriors, a mine of silver, and that I have no need to covet other dominions. We have an equal interest in fostering trade between our subjects." End of quote. So the Sultan, he received this message and he was suspicious, but he agreed to the treaty, albeit reluctantly. So then In response to his acceptance, Genghis Khan sends a caravan of Muslim and Hindu merchants carrying luxury goods to trade with the Khwarizm people. And an Indian man led the delegation and carried a message of friendship to the Sultan. I do find it interesting, just as a side note, that there are representatives from all different backgrounds that are carrying out this mission. I like that. So anyways, back to the story here. The caravan enters Khwarizm in the area of what is today known as Kazakhstan. And the Sultan, he ends up seizing the goods and killing all the merchants and their drivers. Not a good thing. So then Genghis Khan makes an attempt to resurrect this treaty with the Sultan. I mean, maybe it was a big misunderstanding, right? So he sends another group of envoys to the Sultan, and he's requesting punishment for that local official that killed the first people that he sent. And the Sultan responds in the most offensive and public manner possible. He ended up killing some of those envoys, and then the others, he mutilated their faces to send a message back to Genghis Khan. But the Sultan had no idea what horrors would soon be coming his way. Word gets back to Genghis Khan, so he does what he has typically done in the past. He ascends the sacred mountain, Burkhan Khaldun, to pray. He's angry, he's embarrassed, he's frustrated, and as he'd done in the past, he spent 3 days in prayer, and he said, quote, "I was not the author of this trouble. Grant me strength to exact vengeance," end of quote. He would then descend from the mountain and begin another planning process for making war, this time on the Khwarizm. So Genghis Khan wanted peace and open commerce with the Khwarizm Empire. In the interest of finding a mission for his people, it was reasonable to foster this trade agreement, but the Sultan destroyed the opportunity for peaceful trade.
Yeah, and the Mongols go to war again.
Yes. So their society, the Mongol society, was organized around the army and warfare. So Sultan just made a bad decision here.
Yeah.
Not good. So at age 57, Genghis Khan marched his army over 3,000 miles west into Khwarizm. 57 years old, and he's leading his army from horseback. Pretty amazing feat. He must have been in really good shape. So they end up arriving in the spring of the year 1220. And the book says, quote, before the year ended, the Mongols had taken every major city in the Khwarizm Empire, and its Sultan lay abandoned and dying on a small island out in the Caspian Sea where he had sought refuge from the relentless hounding by Genghis Khan's warriors. So I would say in less than 9 months, he had pretty much accomplished the mission there. But the campaign ended up lasting 4 years. And the Mongols, I mean, the book talks about how they just conquered cities as if they were swatting flies. And Genghis Khan followed the same methods that we covered in the last episode, so we won't go into those details. I mean, he just did what he'd done in the past: propaganda campaign, striking on many fronts at the same time, using siege engines to attack the walls of the cities. And some of the cities just surrendered immediately before the attack happened, and others would try to resist, and some lasted a few days or weeks, but eventually all succumbed to the Mongolian army. So there's a key takeaway from this campaign, though. The Mongolian army projected military power thousands of miles from home, and they completely dominated the Khwarizmian Empire. They had no supply train. They just had livestock that traveled with them for food, and they hunted and scavenged for provisions. So that was the Mongols. Now, there's some interesting things that came out about the Khwarizm. The empire itself was combined the lands of Arab, Turk, and Persian civilization. So it covered a vast area. But generally speaking, they were very educated people. They studied math, astronomy, agriculture, and linguistics. And they, at this point in history, had achieved the world's highest rates of literacy. And the book points out that nearly every village in the Muslim world had at least some men who could read the Quran and interpret Muslim law to the people. And this was actually in stark contrast to the rest of the world. In India and Europe, only the priests could read. Down in China, or over in China, only the bureaucrats could read. So the Muslims had a very sophisticated system of commerce, technology, and education. They were some of the richest countries on earth. And they were the most advanced society in the world at the time.
I find this stuff just interesting and really feel let down by history classes in school.
Yeah,
really
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea about this. But here's an interesting thing about the Mongols. They killed at an astounding rate. But they didn't torture and mutilate or maim their enemies. And that's in contrast to other nations and empires at this time in history who frequently used torture and execution to terrorize their enemies. An example in the book here, this Byzantine Christian emperor who had defeated the Bulgarians in the year 1014, he took 15,000 war captives and had their eyes gouged out. But then he left one man out of 100 with one eye so that he could lead the other 99 home, just to send a cruel message to the people back home. Another example that was given in the book was the Christian Crusaders who took Antioch and Jerusalem in the years 1098 and 1099. They ended up slaughtering Jews and Muslims, just men, women, and children of all ages, just executed based on their religion. Now, as a side note here, I just have to point out that committing atrocities under a banner with a cross on it doesn't make you a Christian. So I'll leave it at that. Another example, though, that he gives in the book is in the year in the year 1228, the month of August, there were these 400 Mongol warriors that were captured by a son of the Sultan in Khwarizm. They were tied to horses and dragged through the streets to their deaths. The Mongols were just simply killed for sport and fed to the dogs. Now, they would eventually pay a terrible price when the Mongols retaliated, but just another brutal example here. The book gives other examples, so we won't belabor it, but here's a summary from the book. Quote, by comparison with the terrifying acts of civilized armies of the era, the Mongols did not inspire fear by ferocity or cruelty of their acts, so much as by the speed and efficiency with which they conquered and their seemingly total disdain for the lives of the rich and powerful. The Mongols unleashed terror as they rode east, but their campaign was more noteworthy for its unprecedented military success against powerful armies and seemingly impregnable cities than for its bloodlust or ostentatious use of public cruelty. End of quote. As they did in China, the Mongols destroy the armies of the Khwarizm with ease. The Mongols were a smaller army, but using psychological warfare, superior tactics, and decentralized command along with maneuver warfare. But the Mongols refrained from using these horrific practices that were common to that day.
Yes, and the book points out that the conquered people were shocked at the humane treatment they received after they surrendered.
Yes. Now, for cities that revolted after they had surrendered, the Mongols showed no mercy, and they'd utterly destroy those. But the idea in that scenario was that an annihilated city cannot revolt again. So you weren't given a second chance. So after this 4-year campaign in Khwarizm, now in his early 60s, Genghis Khan plans for a successor. Here's an excerpt from the book. Unlike conquerors who came to think of themselves as gods, Genghis Khan knew clearly that he was mortal, and he sought to prepare his empire for a transition. And now we encounter a time of sadness for Genghis Khan as a father. He ends up holding a Kuriltai, or a council, to negotiate a transition of power to one of his sons. Now, sadly, with all his success in war and building a nation, Genghis Khan's family was just falling apart at this point. He had 4 sons. Joki was the eldest son, and he was Genghis Khan's chosen successor. And then the second son, his name is Chagatai. The third son is Ogude, and the fourth is Toluai. Now, Joki and Chagatai were at each other's throats in this Kuriltai. Chagatai, he just outright rejected Joki as the legitimate heir because there were questions of his paternity. Now, if you remember, in a previous episode, we covered this when Borte, that was Temujin's wife, Genghis Khan's wife, when Borte was abducted years prior, she had been given to another man as his wife. And after her rescue, she was found to be pregnant very soon thereafter. So now Genghis Khan considered Joki his own son. And at that point in time, he declared all children legitimate to battle against basically the bigotry against, these kids that didn't have dads and stuff. But he had declared all children legitimate. Now that's Chagatai and Joki just at each other's throats and fighting over this, because Chagatai could not accept Joki as the firstborn son. And the two younger brothers, they weren't so involved. So Ogedei, he had a penchant for drinking and usually showed up half drunk. And Tolui didn't speak at all in this Kuriltai. And here's an excerpt from the book, quote, "The unpleasant episode cast a pall over the remaining years of Genghis Khan's life," end of quote. So here's the harsh reality for Genghis Khan. His whole life, he mistrusted his own relatives and relied on his companions and friends. And he didn't spend time training his own sons. So they never learned to work together. And Genghis Khan also never took time to teach them how to lead so they could replace him as Khan. So I think this is the pain of every parent. Our kids become adults too fast, and our time with them just runs out, and we look back at the missed opportunities.
Yeah. Genghis Khan is no different than most parents. He was human. He had common frailties and shortcomings as well.
Yes, we all face those. So now he's in his 60s, and Genghis Khan tries to play catch up with his sons. He ends up bringing all 4 of his sons on the Khwarizm campaign, and he made several unsuccessful attempts to impart leadership lessons to his sons. But here's an excerpt from the book. Quote, "After too long a neglect of their education, he tried to teach his sons everything at once. And in doing so, he struggled to articulate lessons he had learned and ideas he had, but had not verbalized clearly. It was just too late, and they were too far gone." And I'll just stop here, and as an aside, just point out that there's a difference between education and training. And maybe we'll talk about this in a future episode, but education is you sit and information is imparted to you. Some of it lands, some of it doesn't. But training is different. Training is something that takes place over a period of time where you're given lessons, but then you're given an opportunity to apply them, and someone comes alongside and helps you to learn those. So there's a big difference between education and training, but we'll talk more about that later. But for now, it's Genghis Khan. It was just too late, and his kids were too far gone. But we do have the lessons that Genghis Khan tried to impart. The very first thing he tried to teach them was self-control. He emphasized mastery of pride. And he said this, quote, "If you can't swallow your pride, you can't lead." And then he says, "Never think of yourself as the strongest or smartest." He tried to emphasize humility and just getting rid of pride. So that was the very first lesson that he taught them, or tried to. The second lesson he taught was don't talk too much. He says this, quote, "A leader should demonstrate his thoughts and opinions through his actions, not through his words. He can never be happy until his people are happy." So pretty simple lesson. Don't talk too much. Let your actions speak. Lesson number 3, the importance of vision, goals, and plans. And he said this to his sons, quote, "Without the vision of a goal, a man cannot manage his own life, much less the lives of others." And then he warned that a vision must also be tempered by wisdom. So this was good. It's like, okay, you don't just come up with a vision and just try to impose that, because honestly, it might be unhinged from reality. So he warns them, hey, a vision's got to be tempered by wisdom. And he said this, quote, "The vision should never stray far from the teaching of the elders." And then he goes on to say, "The old tunic fits better and is always more comfortable. It survives the hardships of life in the bush, while the new or untried tunic is quickly torn." End of quote. So very, very good lesson on vision, goals, and plans. The next lesson he taught was that we should lead a sober and simple life. And he warns against the pursuit of what he called a colorful life with material frivolities and wasteful pleasures. That's a timeless message, right? And then he tells his sons, look, it's easy to forget your vision once you have fine clothes, fast horses, and beautiful women. That message transcends all human history, because we have the same issue today. All right, the last lesson he taught them was that conquering an army is not the same as conquering a nation. So armies are conquered with superior tactics and strategy, but nations, they're conquered through the hearts of the people. Those were the primary lessons he tried to teach, but as mentioned, the training was just too late. It was just information, and there wasn't time for it to really sink in and for it to be applied. So Genghis Khan's sons and their successors, they ended up just ignoring the lessons. Now, the lessons had minimal impact on his sons, but I'm glad they were at least recorded for us.
Agreed. So much to learn from history, especially from great leaders. As we stated at the beginning of the series, we're trying to understand Genghis Khan through his life story. He was so much more than just a brutal warrior.
Yes. And now we come to the story of Genghis Khan's death and burial. Here's an excerpt. Quote, during the winter of 1226 to 1227, while en route across the Gobi Desert to make war on the Tangut, Genghis Khan paused to hunt wild horses. He rode a reddish-gray horse that shied when the wild horses charged him, and the skittish horse threw the great Khan to the ground. End of quote. So he's in his 60s out hunting on horseback, so he's a pretty hard dude. But anyways, now we have an injured Genghis Khan. He would continue carrying on with this Tangut campaign against the advice of his wife, and his health never recovered after the fall. And then we learn that 6 months later, August of the year 1227, Genghis Khan died just a few days before the final victory over the Tangut. And then we learn of his very humble burial. As far as preparation of the body, the wife saw to it that the body was prepared in a simple manner, just as Genghis Khan lived. He wore a plain white robe with felt boots and a hat, and he was wrapped in a white blanket with sandalwood wrapped around him for the fragrance. And on the third day after his death, a procession set out for Mongolia with Genghis Khan's body on a humble, small little cart. And they ended up burying him in a secret place, and nobody has ever found it. So Genghis Khan had a very humble beginning and end to his life.
And that is the roller coaster of life.
Yes. So the best summary that we can see of Genghis Khan's life, it actually came from the man himself, where Genghis Khan sends a letter to a Taoist monk in China. And in that letter, he evaluates himself. And we're treated to that in this book. And it starts off with, the voice of the letter is just very simple and clear language. And it just showed common sense. So nothing flowery about it. So I really like that. It starts off with the big question that we all have in our minds. How does Genghis Khan assess his own performance? And he looked at himself, and he viewed the fall of his enemies as their own lack of ability than to Genghis Khan's prowess. And he said about himself, he says, quote, I have not myself distinguished qualities, end of quote. So he regarded the other civilizations as just having been condemned by the eternal blue sky because of their haughtiness and what he called extravagant luxury. And he looked at his victories as possible only through the assistance of the eternal blue sky. And then he goes on and talks about wealth. And despite his extreme wealth, he lived a very simple life. And he said this in the letter. He says, I wear the same clothing and eat the same food as the cowherds and the horse herders. So that was his view about wealth. And then his ideals. He said, I hate luxury and I exercise moderation. So he was kind of unaffected by all of the wealth around him. And then the letter shows his very high regard for the people of Mongolia. He regarded his subjects. He treated them with kindness, like his own children. And he said this about them. He says, we make the same sacrifices and share the riches. So that was how he regarded just everyday people. But then he looked at talented men and regarded them as brothers, no matter where they came from. And then he talked about his relationship with the officials of the Mongol court. And he says this, quote, we always agree in our principles and are always united in mutual affection. So that was his very high regard for the people of Mongolia. And then he considered himself more successful in war than in peace. And he said this about himself. He says, I fear that in my ruling there may be something wanting. So he admitted in that letter an inability to find men as good in administration as they were in fighting in war. So this final letter was definitely not typical of what we'd see from world leaders today. I mean, there was just zero self-aggrandizement.
Yeah, he certainly did seem to have a holistic view of himself, a view that seems kind of difficult to arrive at given his background.
Yes. And the book goes on to describe the world war that the Mongols engaged in after Genghis Khan's death. But we're going to skip over that. If you'd like to read that, please pick up the book. But we're going to skip straight to the fall of the Mongolian Empire. And it starts with the plague. So by the year 1332 in China, there was this flurry of assassinations, disappearances, and deaths that led to multiple people sitting on the throne there. And the plague originated in South China, and the Silk Route just brought it north. The Mongols brought it north with them. There was just utter devastation by the plague. In China alone, in the year 1331, there were reports of 90% of the population of the Hubei province dying from the plague. And then by 1351, 20 years later, 50 to 66% of the entire population of China were dead. So the population in China, looking over 2 centuries, in the 13th century, there were 123 million inhabitants in China. By the 14th century, there were only 65 million left. That's how devastating the plague was. And the book says the plague spread by, quote, an epidemic of commerce. They were the manufacturing center of the Mongolian Empire, and the goods just poured out of China, and it brought the plague with it. It just spread in all directions at once. And so the system of roads and caravans took the plague everywhere. In 1340, it reached Africa. By 1345, it reached the capital of Russia. In 1348, it was in Italy and England. In 1350, it was all the way over in Greenland. The entire 14th century worldwide, the population went from 450 million people down to 350 to 375 million people. So that's total worldwide deaths of 75 million people from the plague. So that's worldwide. And the plague destroys the Mongolian Empire because they had to cut off ties between Europe, Persia, Russia, China, and the Mongolian homeland just to stop the plague. So naturally, this flow of goods between the nations ceased. And the book uses this phrase. It says, quote, an interlocking system of ownership collapsed. And here's an excerpt from the book. The Mongol Empire depended on the quick and constant movement of people, goods, and information throughout its massive empire. Without those connections, there was no empire. End of quote. So cut off from support and outnumbered by the populace, the Mongol rulers within every region, I mean, that rule was just dismembered. So Russia, Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East, they committed to Islam, their primary religion. And then the Mongols in China, that collapsed in the year 1368. The Mongol rulers, they began to increase repression and isolated themselves. They started confiscating weapons and agricultural tools, and they stopped productions of Chinese opera and storytelling. And they themselves imposed some religious oppression by favoring Buddhism. And then we look at, so that was China, and then Persia, it collapsed in the year 1335. Just a couple of excerpts from the book. Quote, the universal principles of Genghis Khan's empire disappeared like ashes in the wind. In one country after another, indigenous rebellions expelled the Mongols, and local elites took the reins of government. So the trade routes and lines of communication that the Mongols established turned out to be the downfall of the empire.
Yeah, and just like that, we have the end of an empire.
Yes. The plague. Genghis Khan lived an extraordinary yet humble life. In the end, the mighty warrior looked back over his life wishing just simply that he'd been a better dad and just a better leader. He died as he lived, very simply, with no fanfare, and the Mongols buried him secretly so his grave wouldn't become a shrine. Now, the Mongol Empire continued on for another 130, 140 years, but it ended because of that global pandemic. So this ends the series on the life of Genghis Khan, but in future episodes, we're going to build on this, and we'll be sharing stories on topics we encountered during this study. Things like leadership, relationships, human development. So please connect and share any topics that you'd like to discuss.
You can do that by reaching us on our website or socials, which are listed in the description of this episode, or feel free to shoot us an email, feedback@clutteredpath.com. Any feedback or questions.
We welcome your input. Thanks for listening to The Cluttered Path. Today's episode was made possible by the writings of Jack Weatherford from his book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Copyright 2004 by Broadway Books, a division of Penguin Random House. The music for today's episode is used with permission of the Lack family.